And welcome to the Anthropocene reading group. This is our penultimate meeting of the year. So I just wanted to flag before I forget right away that we have one more on histories of heating on June 4th. That should be really wonderful. We'll put a link to that in the chat, and it will, of course, be available online through all of the usual channels. Today's meeting is going to be on scarcity, and in particular, the book with the same title, with professors Fredrik, Albritton, Jonsson, and Carl Wennerlind. So we'll be discussing the recent volume. The full title is Scarcity, A History from the Origins of Capitalism to the Climate Crisis, and it's out with Harvard University Press. We'll talk about that and then some of the themes and ideas arising from it. If you've had a chance to read the book already or to read the brief note that we circulated before the reading group, then great. If not, hopefully you'll get a good sense of it from the summary that we have ahead of the open discussion. So I'm just going to introduce each of our speakers very briefly, and then I'm going to hand it over to them to talk about their book. Also, I should probably introduce myself. I'm Robert Suits. I'm a lecturer in environmental history at UCL. So Dr. Wennerlind is professor of history at Barnard College. He specializes in the history of early modern Europe with a focus on intellectual history and political economy. So his other books besides this one include Casualties of Credit, The English Financial Revolution from 1620 to 1720, and A Philosopher's Economist, Hume and the Rise of Capitalism, and that's together with Margaret Chabas. He's currently working on 2 books, I believe, on early modern Swedish political economy and the history of debates around capitalism. And then our other author today, Dr. Albritton Jonsson, is associate professor at the University of Chicago. He specializes in British history, the history of science, and environmental history. So his other books include Enlightenment's Frontier, The Scottish Highlands and the Origins of Environmentalism, and Green Victorians, The Simple Life in John Ruskin's Lake District, together with Vicky Albritton. He is, questioning the tense here, currently working on a book on fossil fuels and the growth of the British economy, which will hopefully be out fairly soon. So thank you both for being here. Thank you everyone in the audience for being here. Let's just begin with a quick overview of the book, and then we can move to a fairly open discussion. So yeah, take it away.
Great, Carl. I'll share slides, yeah?
Okay, excellent. So thanks, Robert, for the introduction, and even more importantly, thanks for having us. It's a real honor, and we're really looking forward to the questions and the discussions after our fairly brief overview of our project. So our book is really an effort to grapple with the intellectual history of the climate, biodiversity, and Earth systems crisis. It's an effort to come to terms with the origins and evolution of the idea that we are living in a cornucopian world, and how we came to believe that it was possible to have infinite growth in a finite world. We don't dispute that economic growth has been, in many ways, beneficial. In fact, Marx even recognized that capitalism has accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals. And of course, that was in 1848. Imagine the awe he would have expressed had he been in New York City in present times. Most of us, or most of our contemporaries, are of course accustomed to the idea of infinite economic growth or incessant economic growth, but it's really quite a novel concept. So for 99.9993% of the time that Homo sapiens have roamed the earth, there is no such thing as economic growth whatsoever. There are, of course, many, many different explanations for why this growth emerged. One important component that we as intellectual historians have focused on is the kind of zeitgeist or worldview that has enabled us to think in terms of this rather curious concept of indefinite and infinite economic growth. We're of course told by modern economists that economics can indeed continue in perpetuity, that resource use should be maximized to promote consumer welfare, right? That the world exists for us as consumers. And then finally, that science will always come up with substitutes if resources starts running low. And we can see this quote here from Robert Solow, in which he said in 1974, the world can, in effect, get along without natural resources. So exhaustion is just an event, not a catastrophe. So progress is eternal. The future will be better than today. And economic growth provides the answer to almost all of our challenges and problems, whether those are economic, social, political, or even existential or spiritual. Right? So economic growth has become a kind of mantra, it's become a kind of raison d'etre for modern society. And political debates are frequently focused on economic growth as the panacea that will allow us to deal with whatever challenges comes our way. Now, at the root of the growth concept and infinite growth is its opposite, right? That of scarcity. So if you wander into an Econ 101 class, whether here at Columbia and Barnard or at University of Chicago or UCL or anywhere else, the professor is going to tell you that everything in the world is scarce. On one level, that's of course a truism because time and space and resources are limited, but that's not really how modern economists really define the term. They use it in a very specific manner. They make the assumption that everything is scarce based on three assumptions. The first one and the most important one, well, I don't know if we want to rank them, but the first one nevertheless is that humans congenitally, right, naturally have insatiable desires. That's a component of humanity. It's biological. We always want more. Doesn't matter if you're rich or poor or where you live on the globe, you always want more. So one of the key figures behind modern economics, Karl Menger, suggested that one man may live in a palace, consume the choicest foods, and dress in the most costly garment. Another may find his resting place in the dark corner of a miserable hut, feed on leftovers, and cover himself with rags. But both of them face the issue of scarcity. Both of them want more incessantly. So they therefore have to face a variety of choices. The second assumption that economists make is that everything in the world is fungible. Anything, almost like alchemy, can be something else through the market. So that means that if you have some resources that you don't necessarily want because you can transform them through the market to something that you want, it means that everything is fluid. Everything is indeed fungible. And the third assumption that neoclassical economists assume is substitutability. And this is what Robert Solow's comment was pertaining to. The idea that if you run out of organic resources, you can always replace them with inorganic resources. So that suggests that that science will always find a way out of us overusing the globe's resources, and as we'll talk about later, overusing our sinks, which is most important to our argument. So if you're faced with a world of scarcity, where everything is scarce at all times, right, and everyone wants more all the time, that is suggesting that the only path forward is to move towards maximum resource utilization. So you want to use your resources as effectively as possible and to try to extract as much consumer welfare from the natural world as possible. And the second is, of course, that you want to come up with the best kind of technology to facilitate economic growth. And what that means is, of course, that you're coming up with ways to turn nature into economic wealth, right? So those are the two sort of behavioral outcomes of the assumption of scarcity. The problem from our point of view is that this worldview has been way too successful, right? It has achieved its ends and then some. So the great acceleration that commences in the post-war era has produced so much wealth, but also so many side effects that we're now dealing with a climate crisis, a biodiversity crisis, and a resource exhaustion crisis, and also an Earth systems crisis, right? So what to do with this, right? What to do with this moment that we've entered that Fredrik and I call planetary scarcity, right? A stage in which it's not just an assumed condition of scarcity, but we're actually facing real serious limitations on our ability to grow further while maintaining the Earth as an inhabitable space. So how do you approach that? Well, of course, there needs to be many different responses to this. Some people suggest that we should trust genetic engineering, nanotechnology, AI, geoengineering, et cetera, et cetera. And, those might be part of the eventual solution. That is not the route we're going in our book. Instead, we focus on the need to really move beyond neoclassical economics in the way that it's traditionally exercised. We want to empower people to rethink the relationship between economy and nature. We want to basically perturb the normalized and naturalized version of neoclassical economics and its scarcity assumption. We want to kind of suggest to readers, and we're aiming this book mostly at sort of younger social scientists who are entering into the academic world and who are interested in rethinking the foundation of how we think economically about resources and climate. And we believe that by showing that there are many, many different ways in the past that we've thought about and theorized the relationship between the economy and nature. So what Fredrik now is going to do is he's going to talk about the 11 different ways of scarcity, and there are undoubtedly many more, but these are the most salient ones that we decided to focus on, and we'll see that they're based on a very different conception of how society operates and how individuals experience and think and behave in the economy. So over to you, Fredrik.
Thanks so much, Carl, and thanks everyone for joining us for this discussion. We're looking forward to your comments. I'll give you a thumbnail sketch of the general argument of the book. So as Carl just mentioned, the point of the book is to excavate a long history of ideas about scarcity. And here we follow really two guidelines. We think of scarcity as a combination of thinking about the economy and human desire on the one hand, and on the other, thinking about the nature of nature, conceptions of the environment, and the divine order. So when you do that, you can arrive at a series of ideal types. These ideal types each get a chapter in our book. And I stress that these are, some of them are close to being actors' categories in their own moment. But in Weberian terms, we have taken certain liberties with the evidence to give the sharpest possible definition of each ideal type. So as you see, we range all the way from the 1500s, from the pre-Reformation world of European thought, and all the way into the present, and the moment we call planetary scarcity, which is, I know you're all interested in the debate about the Anthropocene. So you might think of planetary scarcity as an attempt to tackle the Anthropocene problem from the point of view of the history of economic thought. Now, why begin in 1500 and not say 1600 or even later? I mean, some theorists and historians might prefer just to cover the great acceleration from about 1950 on as the true rupture in the story. Well, we're both trained as early modernists, so we have our own professional biases, but we both believe that it's necessary to take a longue durée view of changes to the conception of human desire and changes to notions of the environment and the natural world that cover really the transition from what Tony Wrigley calls the organic economy and into the mineral energy economy. So, there is in our history of ideas a subtext, an interest in material histories. As you heard from Robert, Carl and I are both trained not simply in intellectual history, but we also work on histories of capitalism and histories of the environment. That's not the main focus of our book, but it explains the arrangement of the ideal types you see here. So in short, we move from an overwhelmingly agrarian world with few urban centers, with little in the way of consumer society or consumer culture, through the convulsions of the 17th century, the Little Ice Age, and then into the Industrial Revolution, and then the 19th century conceptions of scarcity are in many ways best understood as critiques of early understandings of industry and human power over nature. So that's where the Romantic, the Malthusian, and the Socialist fit in. And then, as you just heard, by the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, we come under the spell of a new idea of scarcity, neoclassical scarcity, which we argue rather quickly became dominant in the West and in advanced societies, and now has a more or less hegemonic position in shaping not just economic theory, but also policy and politics. Now, we often get into trouble when we say that, because economists don't take kindly to this kind of stereotyping. They will point out that economic theory now is much more diverse than simply the neoclassical current. And there are many, many new approaches, behavioral economics, environmental economics, and so forth. And that's absolutely right. But if we take a bird's eye view, we still insist that outside the corridors of academia, neoclassical scarcity remains dominant. However, as Carl mentioned a moment ago, the planet itself is now weighing in on this quarrel about the nature of scarcity, in the sense that we're beginning to see dramatic planet-wide environmental effects of unrestrained economic growth. And that's, again, what we think of as the inception of a new kind of scarcity. And we stress that this idea of planetary scarcity is not fully determined yet. We don't know exactly what environmental condition we're headed for. If we're still perhaps within the limits of 1.5 degrees Celsius, or whether we are headed towards somewhere much more unpleasant. Planetary scarcity, the science of the planet will surely determine what this new notion of economic scarcity might look like. So it's really incipient rather than fully formed. Now, one more point about the use of a longue durée approach. By organizing our history of ideas into these ideal types, we suggest, first of all, that it's possible to track the origins of neoclassical scarcity farther back in time. Neoclassical scarcity depends on conceptions of human desire and nature, which first emerged in the 17th century, paradoxically during the Little Ice Age, when Europe and the Northern Hemisphere came under a great deal of environmental pressure. We call this ancestral form of scarcity cornucopian scarcity. Cornucopian scarcity here stands for a vision held in common by Francis Bacon and other natural philosophers, as well as alchemists and early political economists. And they, by the 1680s, 1690s, we get the fusion of two radical ideas of nature, of external nature and human nature. On the one hand, the notion that humans can have godlike power over the environment, so Baconian mastery, and the power to make new things. Here, Francis Bacon's little fable, The New Atlantis, is especially paradigmatic in our view, in as far as it describes a utopian scientific community that calls itself the College of 6 Days' Work. You see how the notion of imitating the divine, as set out in Genesis, sort of produces this new notion of human domination over the earth, legitimate domination. And paired with this new idea of mastery over nature, also is a new idea of the legitimacy of insatiability. So a defense among early political economists of man or humanity as a creature of passion driven by endless desires that take ever new forms. Now, if you move a little bit earlier in the timeline, exactly this kind of creature of insatiable desire would have been castigated as a creature of sin and destined for damnation. But by the 17th century, we begin to see a re-evaluation of human desire and a defense of consumer society. Of course, again, there are material, social, economic reasons for this intellectual reevaluation. It doesn't come out of nowhere. It draws from the vibrant new trade networks in the Atlantic. It draws on early plantation societies, new cash crops. It draws on what Jan de Vries calls the industrious revolution, the allocation of labor into the wage economy. So this is one of the uses of our longue durée approach, is to kind of is to show a prehistory of neoclassical scarcity, going back to this moment of cornucopian ideology. But it is very important to realize that cornucopianism of the 17th century was not yet a dominant current in society and culture. It was often resisted and rejected by the establishment in politics and religion. and in culture. It was the view of, as I said, alchemists and eccentrics and cranks to a considerable degree. And it was tainted by scandal, by the South Sea bubble and financial oscillations that frightened people. So to that extent, the dominant tenor of culture and ideas remained beholden to earlier conceptions of nature. And here comes the second great use of doing a longue durée analysis. Once we see how ideas of human mastery and insatiability evolved, we can also begin to identify resistance and repudiation of this view. And that really goes back to traditional religious notions of the great chain of being, of hierarchy, of the body politic. And this is what we call neo-Aristotelian scarcity. In essence, a worldview where human desires should be constrained, tempered by hierarchy, by virtue, by Christian morality, and where nature itself is considered not an endless storehouse of resources, but a hierarchy organized by God to satisfy limited desires. So really a finite conception of nature. And as we move forward in time, we see how this finitarian worldview, this idea of finite desire in a finite world, takes a number of different forms. So it becomes possible through our ideal types to see basically a great tension across the past 500 years of cornucopian notions of human nature and nature pitted against finitarian conceptions of nature and human desire. So again, the umbrella categories then by which we can organize our 11 ideal types fall into, on the one hand, cornucopian notions, and on the other, finitarian. One other added virtue of this longue durée analysis is that we can overcome what we think of as a false binary between cornucopian and Malthusian notions of the environment. When historians invoke limits as a historical construct, as an organizing principle of thought, it's often said that this is simply a Malthusian mistake. It's a fallacy that's, that represents a particularly hideous ideology of domination that emerged in the late 18th century and flowered in the early Victorian era. Malthus was proven wrong long ago, and this whole notion of limits is, in fact, an illusion. Right? That critique is built into the neoclassical conception of scarcity, as you could probably guess. Now, by telling a much richer history of finitarian scarcity, we recognize that Malthusian scarcity, although powerful and certainly influential, was never the only game in town. It was never the only version of finitarian scarcity. There are others, including the neo-Aristotelian notion I just described, as well as the romantic idea of scarcity, which, very briefly put, is an aesthetic and spiritual notion of nature as a refuge, where critics and refugees from urban consumer culture can go to purify themselves and imitate virtuous peasants in a serene rural environment. So romantic scarcity is certainly tied up with ideas of finitude, but not at all the dynamic of population growth and the finite food supply that Malthusian scarcity centers on. Now, I don't want to take up the whole hour with this thumbnail sketch, but I'll just finish with one final thought, which is planetary scarcity represents in our survey a new kind of finitarian position. So very briefly put, if I scroll forward here to the present moment, planetary scarcity encapsulates the discovery that the stability and habitability of the Earth system depends on the safe absorption of man-made waste by the Earth system. We'll just emphasize one parameter of this mechanism here, and that is how the carbon cycle in its quote-unquote normal functioning, its Holocene functioning, depends on the uptake of excess carbon into the planetary sinks, the oceans, the atmospheres, and the Earth itself. Now, what's happening at the current moment, one of the many effects of the Great Acceleration, is to overload the system with excess carbon, which, as you all know, produces and intensifies a greenhouse effect, among other things. So planetary scarcity, in our definition, is the condition of scarcity where a minority of the world's population, through acts of overconsumption of carbon-intensive commodities, end up overloading the Earth system and destabilizing the Earth system. So you see how that differs from other kinds of finitarian scarcity that I've just mentioned. It is not a Malthusian condition. It is not the product of overpopulation pressing on food production. It's not about limits of growth through resource constraints. Although certainly the destabilization of the Earth system will have an impact on food production and may end up troubling our food supply in tragic ways. But the specific root cause of planetary scarcity is not that. It's again the overloading of the planetary sinks through the overconsumption of carbon-intensive commodities by a minority of the world's population. I could say a lot more, but I'll just leave you with one of the images from the book, which is a close-up of one of the carbon sinks, phytoplankton in the Atlantic Ocean. We end our book with a little parable about what sort of new economic notion of desire and nature might emerge under the pressure of planetary scarcity. And we suggest that this might be an economics that is framed and organized within the rubric of Earth system science. So instead of having an economic neoclassical economics of scarcity where man dominates, we're embedding the economy inside the global environment, and centering or recentering our sense of economic growth and economic well-being on the non-human, including here the absolute centrality of phytoplankton to the stability of the Earth system. As I'm sure you're all aware, it's a major carbon sink, and it's of course also a source of oxygen, and at the basis of food chains in the oceans. Phytoplankton has virtually no role yet in human culture or human politics and human economics, but perhaps one day it will be. So it's a good starting point for what we call an age of ecological repair, where we come to recognize the centrality of the environment to everything human, and begin to pay heed, and mend our ways and reject this cornucopian ideology in favor of something very different. So thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you both for that presentation. Yeah, so we will move to a Q&A. We'll stop the recording. See if I have the